Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. The challenge of climate change is profound. The risks it poses are dire. Confronting those dangers is among the paramount tests of our time. We owe it to one another and to future generations to meet the challenge with the intensity, the creativity, and the cooperative effort that the situation demands. It's, of course, not enough simply to recognize the magnitude of the problem. We must work ever harder to find practicable, effective, meaningful solutions. Solutions rooted in both imaginative ingenuity and real-world realities. Solutions that draw on the interplay of different fields and points of view. Solutions born of bringing key players together to mediate disparate interests and find common ground. Solutions that spur the transition to cleaner, greener energy and sustainable ways to live. Universities have a crucial role to play. We act through our research, our educational programs, our embrace of sustainability on our campus, our engagement with the wider world. What we can achieve depends critically on how we engage with others, policymakers, leaders in industry and civil society, entrepreneurs and engineers, concerned citizens, and people of goodwill everywhere. And we must act together in ways that capitalize on the distinctive academic power of our universities. Today, we are fortunate to welcome a distinguished panel of experts who will help us both see the challenge more vividly and illuminate possible pathways forward. They come from a range of disciplines and points of view, from the academy and beyond. They can together speak to both science and policy, both innovative ideas and the avenues to genuinely effective action. I'm grateful to all of them for taking part, and even more, for devoting their lives to what they do and energizing us by their example. They are just a few of the great many members of our extended community who share a deep commitment to finding real solutions to climate change, and who, in a remarkable variety of ways, have made it integral to their life's work. I thank all of our panelists for being with us, and I thank all of you who, in no small measure, shared their devotion. After our panelists have had the opportunity to discuss their wide-ranging perspectives, a question and answer period will give you a chance to join the conversation. With that, let me welcome our moderator. We are deeply honored to have him here to lead this important discussion. He is the much admired co-anchor of CBS This Morning and the incisively inquisitive host of the long-running PBS interview show that bears his name. I'm pleased to introduce the inimitable and estimable Charlie Rose.
Thank you, Madam President Drew. Thank you so much. I suspect that would not have gotten me in Harvard, though. I'm honored to be here. This is a place that has had and been at the center of research, of conversation, of learning, and we try to bring all of that here to talk about one of the critical issues, as the President has outlined, facing all of us on this globe in this time of enormous concern. And we want to talk about a whole range of factors. We want to talk about the science. We want to talk about resistance to science. We want to talk about solutions. We want to talk about institutions that may have an impact, including universities. We want to talk about governmental organizations. And we want to talk about divestment. And we want to talk about looking to the future. All of that which are part of the debate about a crucial issue facing all of us. And so I began introducing this panel and then have a conversation, allow what they say resonate within you so that if there are questions that you have, we'll come back to you and give you an opportunity after the initial conversation here to raise your points and your questions. I ask you to ask questions and not to make statements so that we can have a lot of people participate here and maximize the conversation. Joining me, as Drew has said, is a very distinguished panel. Joseph Aldy is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, former Special Assistant to the President for Energy and Environment at the White House. Christopher Thiel, Co-Chair of the Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Founding Director of the Department of Global Ecology, Carnegie Institution for Science, and Lane Professor for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies at Stanford, member of the Harvard University Board of Overseers, Harvard Class of '75. Rebecca Henderson, McArthur University Professor at Harvard University, Co-Director of Business and Environmental Initiative, the Harvard Business School. John Holdren, the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology at the White House, Co-Chair of the President's Council on Advisors on Science and Technology, former Heinz Professor of Environmental Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, former Professor of Environmental Science and Public Policy at the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard. Richard Newell, Gendell Professor of Energy and Environmental Economics at Duke, Director of the Duke University Energy Initiative, former Administrator of U.S. Energy Information Administration, former Senior Economist for Energy and Environment, the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Harvard, PhD in 1997. Naomi Oreskes, Professor of History of Science and Director of Graduate Studies at the Department of History and Science here at Harvard, and co-author of Merchants of Doubt, how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. And finally, Daniel Schrag, Sturgis Hooper Professor of Geology, Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering, and Director of the Harvard University Center for the Environment. But I want to begin with John Holdren and have him lay out for us what is the national policy and what is the science that undermines that policy. John?
Underlies.
Underlies, I think we want to say, or underpins. There are, and let me start with the science. I think there are 5 fundamental understandings that have emerged from climate science that underpin the administration's climate policy. The first one is the climate is changing in ways not consistent with what we know about natural influences. The second insight is we actually know what the principal driver is. It's human activities, primarily in the form of burning fossil fuels and land use change. The third understanding is that these changes in climate, which are far more extensive and complex than mere changes in average temperature. They involve changes in circulation patterns, in rain and snow, in the tracks and power of storms, in the prevalence of floods and droughts and so on. These effects are already happening. This is not just a problem for future generations, not just a problem for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Climate change is doing harm now in many places across the United States, in many places around the world. The fourth fundamental understanding is that that harm is going to continue to grow for some time to come. The momentum in the climate system and the momentum in the Earth's energy system, in society's energy system, are such that we cannot stop this process overnight no matter what we do. But the fifth understanding is there's an enormous difference in how much harm we can expect between the case when we take prompt and aggressive action and the case where we do very little. We will see a lot of harm if we do very little. We will see much less if we take aggressive action. And based on those 5 fundamental understandings, the Obama administration, under the president's leadership, has produced a climate action plan that has 3 big pillars. The first pillar is reducing domestic emissions of the greenhouse gases that are the primary drivers of global climate change. The second pillar is increasing the nation's preparedness and resilience against the changes in climate that we can no longer stop. And the third pillar is international leadership to get other countries to do what they need to do, both in the emissions reduction space and in the preparedness and resilience space.
Are you getting that, looking to what the president did and was able to achieve in China?
I think we are making progress on all of those fronts. U.S. domestic greenhouse gas emissions are down by about 10% from 2005. We're on track to meet the goal the president stated in 2009 of getting 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. We announced at the joint announcement you referred to with China in November of last year a goal of getting to 26 to 28% below by 2025. We believe if the ingredients of the Climate Action Plan, including the EPA's Clean Power Plan, to get emissions from fossil fuel burning power plants under control are implemented, we will get there. We will be on that trajectory, and that trajectory points us in the longer run to where we need to be in years further ahead, including in the vicinity of 80% below 2005 emissions by 2050. In the preparedness and resilience space, we've got tremendous engagement from governors, from mayors, from tribal leaders around the country working with the federal government, and the data and the tools that the federal government can help provide and that the private sector is helping to provide to build resilience and preparedness. And on the international pillar, again, I think the China joint announcement speaks for itself, but it has led, in addition to an extraordinary degree of cooperation with India, most recently Mexico, and there will be others. And of course, all of it's leading up to the Paris conference in December of this year, where we will be in pursuit of a durable, comprehensive, forward-looking agreement to get everybody on board.
Christopher, tell us more about where the science is, adding to what John said.
John's already characterized the key elements. Climate change is already occurring, the effects are comprehensive and they're widespread. Every country has experienced the impacts of climate change to date. It's also clear that there are solutions and that there's a dramatic difference between the level of impacts that occur with ambitious mitigation and with continued high emissions. When we think about solutions, probably the most dramatic thing is that we know that eventually we're going to need to drive the emissions of heat-trapping gases to zero, not the starting points, which are important, critically important, 26, 28% by 2025, 80% by 2050. Eventually we have to go to zero. That's challenging, but it's also incredibly empowering, because what that means is that the energy technologies that are going to drive the future have to be the non-emitting ones. And when we talk about building energy systems for the future, we really need to be talking about the only option is ones that don't have a net release of heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere.
Daniel?
No, I think that's exactly right. Ultimately, this is about developing the technologies that will ultimately be disruptive and replace fossil fuels altogether. The problem is that right now we're so deeply addicted to fossil fuels in all the sectors of our economy, and we need to change that. And the pace of change is far too slow. That's why what John said about preparedness is so important, that ultimately we're not going to be able to avoid. And this may be one of the reasons why the public has a difficult time with the idea of a solution, because it's a solution, but it's not really fixing the problem. The emissions that we've already contributed to this, and the ones that will continue for the next 50 years, will have a legacy effect for a very long time. As a geologist, I can tell you there'll be an effect for tens of thousands of years. But that long time scale doesn't mean that the short time scale isn't urgent and immediate. And ultimately, it's about developing the technologies that will be displaced. And a lot of that innovation is actually happening right now.
I think there's two characteristics of the science that make the policy and the political economy so hard. One is that the impacts of our actions today yield benefits, not just today, but many, many years in the future. And some of those benefits will be quite significant in the future beyond the career lifetimes of politicians who are making those decisions today. So they feel like, I may decide to do something today, it may impose costs today, but a lot of those benefits will occur well after not just my next election, but any number of elections I may think to run over the course of my career. The second problem is that reducing a ton of CO2, whether it's here in Boston or in Beijing, has the same impact in mitigating climate change. And it's that characteristic, the fact that we can generate global benefits from our actions today, that actually creates an incentive for people to look at each other and for countries to look at each other and governments to look at each other and say, maybe I'll wait and let you reduce your emissions more, and I'll enjoy some of the benefits from doing that. And that really, I think, is what underpins the challenge in trying to coordinate actions in international negotiations. I think that's why it's so important, as John alluded to, that the US and China said, we're their two biggest emitters, we're their two biggest historic emitters, and we're willing to move forward together in lockstep and take some actions to mitigate emissions and demonstrate leadership, and we hope that galvanizes action by other countries to work with us in a coordinated fashion in tackling the problem.
Rebecca, has science, has the academy, has the media done an effective job of communicating the science and the urgency and the risk of not acting?
To whom is the question? So I think in many parts of the world, the science is widely accepted and the need to act is widely accepted. But here in the US, particularly in the business establishment, there's still significant doubt about whether, well, maybe this isn't really happening, and by the way, change is difficult and hard and expensive. And so I think we still have some way to go. My reading, if I could move away from the it's really hard to, but there's going to be upside, is we need to do a better job of communicating the risk framing. I think sometimes this is heard as a religious war. You know, climate change is happening or it isn't. And what I found really helpful talking to business people is framing it as a, well, let's suppose it's only 25% happening. You know, if 1 in 4 of the doctors you consulted said you had a very serious issue and needed an operation, you'd have the operation. And if, as is the case, 4 out of 5 of the doctors you consult say you need to act now, then you need to act. And so I think we need to frame it not as a religious war, as we're trying to extend the power of government, but as a failure in the market that we know how to fix. We have really good private sector solutions, and we're responding to a business risk, which is what business people do all the time.
But Naomi, there's an entrenched resistance.
Yes, and I think your Freudian slip right at the beginning of this about
Yes.
the undermining the science, of course, spoke to that.
I'm not sure it's Freudian, but
Yeah. Everything that everyone has said is true, but there's an additional component, and that additional component is that, and it's the additional component that helps to explain the difference between what's happened in the United States in terms of public understanding versus in most of the rest of the world, which is that for more than 20 years now, there's been organized, well-funded opposition to the science whose purpose has been to try to undermine it, to try to persuade people, particularly in the business community, but also ordinary American citizens, that the science isn't clear, that John's 5 points, maybe we're not really that sure, and since we're not sure, why should we act? And in any case, it's an excuse to expand government and raise taxes, which we don't like. So that story, that history, that reality, I think poses a gigantic challenge to us as scholars and intellectuals, because as scholars, as professors, as researchers, as members of this august community, we're committed to a model of knowledge that tells us that knowledge is power. That if we learn these things and we explain them clearly, as John just did, and we talk to people in our business community in ways that are non-confrontational, that sort of rational approach, that knowledge-based approach, will persuade people. And the reality is that it does in our community, but it doesn't in a lot of the world, and it doesn't in part because there's an organized effort to prevent it from doing so.
But what is it you need to persuade them? I mean, is it about the resistance about large government? Is it about detrimental impact on the economy? What is it at heart to people who look at the science and the overwhelming evidence of the science and say no?
Well, I think this is part of the challenge. What we think we need to persuade people of and what they think this is about is also very different. So most people in the scientific community have thought for a long time this was about explaining the science. It was about persuading people of John's key points that the climate's changing, it's changing in ways that are not natural, we know why it's changing, we know what this means, all this fact-based information. But the fear that many people in the business community, many people in the heartland of America, many people even in Massachusetts have, is that this is really an excuse to expand government, increase taxes, deprive us of our personal freedom, and push a left-wing, socialistic, environmentalist agenda. And that may seem silly to a lot of people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but that's a very, very real belief in a lot of parts of America, and it's a belief that people in the business community, people in the fossil fuel industry, people in libertarian and conservative think tanks have deliberately fostered in order to prevent action on climate change for fear that it will challenge their interests in different sorts of ways.
Richard, if you were, go ahead. My question was going to be, if you were sitting in a room of people who somehow weren't convinced, what is it you would tell them?
Well, I think part of this is there's many different perspectives that people come to this issue with. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that we really do need to be finding solutions. So we don't want to be daunted and disheartened by the size of the challenge, but it is important to recognize that there is a real challenge. And so let me give some perspective on that. So we're not just talking about one piece of the economy. We're not just talking about one region of the country or of the world. We're talking about the entire world. We're talking about the entire economy. Energy is pervasive throughout the economy, and over 80% of that is currently fossil fueled. So there's going to be a very, very significant change in a basic infrastructure underpinning of our economy to move forward on this. Every day we use 90 million barrels of oil. We use 20 million tons of coal. We use 300 billion cubic feet of gas every day. So this is a big challenge. That doesn't mean we don't need to address it, but it means that there really will be a significant change for many people who operate in the current economy we live in. So I think this is important to keep in mind, along with the points that Joe made, that this is going to require international coordination, to think about the kinds of solutions we need to be looking for. We need solutions that are going to scale to meet the growing energy demands of our US and global economy. We're going to need to find solutions that make sense in the market and policy context that individuals and businesses operate in. We're going to need solutions that are going to be able to make impact now, but more importantly, have very significant impact over the longer term. And I think finally I would say we need to get going on this, but we also need to have a sense of patience, because energy capital is very long-lasting in the economy, just like greenhouse gas emissions are very long-lasting in the atmosphere. So patience and persistence is going to be at the heart of the solution, I think.
John, you were nodding your head in agreement.
Well, I think one further point about what it takes to persuade people. People are becoming persuaded in increasing numbers by what they see around them, by what is happening. Climate change has become evident, and people are experiencing it in their homes, in those who farm in their farms, those who forest in the forests, those who fish in the fisheries. People are experiencing it in changing weather patterns that everybody notices. That doesn't necessarily convince them about the causes, but it convinces them that something unusual is happening. And in fact, the Senate voted not long ago 98-1 to say that climate change is not a hoax. And the reason was everybody is noticing that it's happening.
Who was the one?
A smaller percentage agree that humans are causing it. But if you even only agree that it's happening, this is substantial reason for investment in preparedness and resilience. So we can already get those folks with simply the argument that it's happening. The other thing that I have noticed is that as we have become able to provide people with more data and more analysis that underscores not only what is happening now where they live and work, but where things are going, they become interested not only in preparedness and resilience, but they become interested in mitigation, because they see how hard it's going to be adequately prepared, adequately adaptive, adequately resilient as the scale of the impacts with which you're trying to deal gets bigger. And the fact is, these approaches, preparedness, resilience, adaptation, they're necessary, but they get more difficult, more expensive, and less effective the larger are the changes in climate to which you're trying to adapt. So we're getting people agreeing that we need to mitigate as well. We've had people meeting with President Obama, governors, mayors, tribal leaders, who were engaged for the purpose of thinking about preparedness and resilience, and they come in after looking at the facts, they say, Mr. President, we've also got to do more on mitigation.
And it simply was looking at the reality of what they see today.
Yes.
But it's not just what they see, it's also what they see around them. One of the challenges with climate, thinking about it as a global issue, is it's global and it's occurring on long timescales. That's really difficult. But what's true about preparedness is what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my home? And it's different here in Cambridge than it is in Colorado, and it's different in Colorado than it is in Delhi. And by people beginning to pay attention to what's going to happen to them locally, they begin to realize that this isn't some big global thing that they can ignore over decades. It actually affects them in their backyard. And that, I think, has some teeth. I think climate may be the kind of thing where the politics change very, very quickly. You know, about 10 years ago on this stage, Al Gore and Larry Summers were talking about climate change, and Larry Summers said something really interesting. He said, it's going to take a really long time for Congress to do anything on climate, a lot longer than people think, but when it happens, it's going to happen really quickly. And I think there may be something to that suddenly there'll be a tidal wave of public opinion, and we will be in a different
And what do you
place.
think will precipitate that?
Well, we saw a glimpse of that maybe with Superstorm Sandy, where Mayor Bloomberg stood up a week before the presidential election and essentially endorsed Obama because of his climate change policies. That was a pretty big deal.
Rebecca?
I think it will be the observation that it can be done and it's not that expensive. And that when you see solar panels going up on roofs and people putting in gas and getting rid of coal, when people see that it's not going to cost as much as they think, and when they participate, because I think the other big issue we need to talk about here is the risk of despair. That, so many people, like, this is this huge, enormous problem, what can I do? It's as we get moving, as people do things, and they see that it can be done, that's what we'll say, well, why aren't we doing this? With a huge injustice to our children, we should act.
Naomi?
I'm a very optimistic and positive person, so I hate to be the voice of negativity, but I want to throw in some negativity here because, we're hearing a lot of positive things, and most of them are focused on individuals, what individuals see, what individuals will do. But there's a big structural issue here as well, and I think your comments speak to this. We are invested in fossil fuel infrastructure, we are invested in fossil fuel technology that is in for the long haul for 30, 40, 50 years. And we are continuing to build that infrastructure even as we speak about how people are putting solar panels on their roofs and recognizing Hurricane Sandy and things like this. And just this morning I read in the Energy Guardian, I wish it was the Energy Garden, that would be better. John mentioned about the EPA's new clean power rule that we're all looking forward to. But in the Energy Guardian this morning, there was a piece about how Republicans in Congress are planning to introduce a bill to prevent the implementation of the Clean Power Rule until after all of the legal challenges have played their course. Now, two things about that. The Clean Power Rule is EPA's response to the Supreme Court telling them under the Massachusetts versus EPA case, a case that faculty here at Harvard helped to argue, that the EPA was required by law under the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon as a greenhouse gas, as a pollutant. So this is what the law of the land tells us EPA needs to do. EPA is doing it, and it's being challenged in court. And who is challenging in court? Not individual citizens, not farmers in Nebraska, but the fossil fuel industry and the coal-based electrical utilities. These people are continuing to fight tooth and nail against the very public policies that would, in fact, encourage people to do the right thing, encourage states and cities to get on board. So I think we have a very big structural issue, and I think that this conversation is not complete if we don't discuss that as well. Sorry, that wasn't meant to be a speech.
So I think when we talk about how you convince people, it's fascinating when you look at some of the survey research. It shows that people's belief, which I have reservations about the use of that term, but belief in the science is correlated with things like the unemployment rate. And there's nothing in the science that suggests the unemployment rate or the state of the economy should be determining how we understand the global climate system. But I think it reflects the fact that a lot of people, when they think about the problem, they think about the problem and the solutions in a joint manner. And I think the fact that we're now in a state of the economy that's very different than it was 6 years ago, the fact, as Rebecca noted, people know they have friends or they've made investments on their own in super efficient vehicles or electric vehicles, or they have friends who have solar panels on the roofs. The idea that you and I can actually make changes in our behavior and our investment decisions and have an impact is something that's very different than when people started thinking about this problem 10, 15 years ago. And I think it makes it more salient and makes it seem more feasible that we can all change our behavior in certain ways to tackle the problem. I remember when I was working in the Clinton administration on Kyoto, a lot of people in the fossil fuel industry said this is going to be like the next OPEC oil embargo. It's going to raise energy prices and destroy the economy. And what we've learned is we can actually do a lot to push out innovative lower carbon and zero carbon technologies, push out energy efficiency, and create new markets, and tap the power of the market in a way that we can help solve the problem, we can start to lower our emissions without undermining economic growth. And I think it's smart policy that keeps driving us in that direction that's really going to engage the people and make meaningful progress.
And what has been the impact of falling oil prices and fracking?
It's mixed. Fracking for natural gas is probably the #1 factor with the fall in emissions in the power sector in the US. We've seen the share that coal had in the US power system fall by 1/5 in a matter of 4 years. You know, if you had the head of EPA implement a regulation that caused coal's share of the power sector to fall by 1/5, I assure you there'd be a lot of people in Congress who'd call her up to testify and yell at her for her regulations destroying coal. As it turns out, natural gas is destroying coal right now. And it illustrates, I think, the power of the market and how that innovation has helped bring in this lower carbon source, lower polluting source of power. And I think that helps in the near term. But as we've already heard, in the long term, we have to go from lower carbon to zero carbon sources.
John.
Well, I would just note that since 2008, wind electricity generation in this country has gone up by a factor of 3.3, and solar electricity generation has gone up by a factor of 20. 20-fold increase in solar generation since 2008. So we are, to be sure, starting from a smaller base when we talk about those extraordinary growth rates. But the fact is that we are moving very smartly in the direction of a cleaner mix of energy sources.
But,
yes.
Yeah, but it's important to note that that's not just happening spontaneously in a free market system, right? It's also partly in response to renewable portfolio standards, tax credits, and other smart public policies that are creating incentives and appropriate price signals.
And one of the things, though, about getting back to the natural gas issue, though, is that actually in the political space, natural gas has allowed a lot of environmental regulation that otherwise would be too costly. I mean, I think it would be very difficult, for example, for the president to introduce his EPA regulations if natural gas wasn't there as a viable alternative. The cost would just be too expensive.
And natural gas enables renewables by providing base power. And I think, Naomi makes a hugely important point about the power of the established fossil fuel industry. We have to remember there are businesses pushing on the other side of this. So recently I was talking to two large European energy companies who are both heavy in natural gas, and they are very keen to see carbon pricing and carbon mechanisms because they can see the advantage for their industry. We're seeing business leaders like Paul Polman stand up and say, we need a carbon price. It's ridiculous we don't have this. So I think if we can mobilize sectors of the economy that are some prevailing counter-influence to the fossil fuel industry, that's also really important.
And a way to think about this is that the natural gas is tremendously important in pushing down the role of coal in the energy sector, but it also has made it more difficult for renewables to come in. The reason it's made it more difficult for renewables to come in is that we're not accounting for the environmental damage that's done by the emissions from the natural gas sector, even though they're less than half as much as from coal. We need to find a way to acknowledge the damage that's being done by the fossil energy technologies and somehow price that into the system. And without that, we'll never get to the level playing field that will enable the renewables to come in as they deserve to, and independent of the political pushback that's there all the time.
So Charlie, you had asked, what is it going to take to kind of increase or accelerate this transition? And I think both Dan and others were right in that it requires people to see increased costs from the current situation that we're in and lowering the costs of transitioning away from that system, which speaks to innovation. And I think it's very important to not view this in a vacuum because while we're focused on energy and climate, there's also other major energy challenges that individuals and countries face. One is just meeting growing energy demands, and the other is energy security and reliability challenges. And so really innovation really is a key toward lowering the cost of that transition. And going back to work that Rebecca and I did together a few years ago and others, there's really three key ingredients that are required for innovation. The shale gas situation is an interesting one because one of the key ingredients is robust accelerating demand for new technology. The thing that led to the shale gas revolution was demand for natural gas, demand for low-cost energy. There was a natural market signal that created the supply of that innovation. When it comes to externalities like climate change, there is not that natural market. It's an externality. And so it's required for government policy to create that demand for that new technology. Once that demand is created through a price on carbon, through a market-based system, through other types of policies, this will create profit opportunities for companies, it'll create a demand incentive for people to buy these technologies, and it'll accelerate that innovation. The other key ingredients are, second one is robust funding for research and development by the government and by private sector, and the third is a vibrant competitive marketplace in ideas and technologies. So this is what we need to accelerate.
Can I just add one point? I want to add to something Rebecca was talking about, which is that the private sector is by no means monolithic in opposition to taking action in this domain, and in fact, the sector within the private sector that was first to advocate taking action was, interestingly enough, the insurance industry. Why is the insurance industry doing this? Because they're seeing claims go through the roof from wildfires, from drought, from storm damage, from flooding, from sea level rise. In 1988, some of the leading reinsurance companies, Munich Re, Swiss Re, were starting to run ads in the International Herald Tribune saying it's time to do something about climate change because of what it was doing to their bottom lines. And they've now been joined by a number of other industries, including those that market energy efficiency technologies, those that are developing and marketing renewable energy technologies, those that build batteries, and so on. So the private sector picture is now pretty interesting.
Can the private sector change the velocity of, can it enhance the velocity of change?
Yes, I think it can. And I think it will. I think what we're seeing, and this is, I have no disagreement with Naomi about the power of the entrenched forces that have been opposing this change, but I think they're starting to lose. I think the combination
Acting out of self-interest.
what people are experiencing and the understanding, the growing understanding of Rebecca's point that it actually isn't that expensive to fix. We can do this. That's changing the whole climate of the debate, if you'll forgive the term.
So I think one of the challenges, though, is the political uncertainty and people in the private sector waiting to get a sense of what the policy framework will look like. I mean, there are those who have been thinking about and planning for a price on carbon for more than a decade, and they've indicated, in a sense, even though you may not think it's really in their interests, they're kind of tired of waiting for the political debate. They just want to know what the rules of the road will look like going forward, and they can work with that. And I think if you resolve that kind of uncertainty, it then starts to make it much more clear what kind of technology investments, what kind of R&D programs can yield really important payoffs if you've got a clear sense of what the policy, whether it's going to be a price on carbon, something like what EPA is trying to do in the Clean Power Plan, et cetera, what that means for their industry.
Chris, can tell me about the sort of a global climate regime, the idea of where that progress is?
Well, there's a lot to be done. The bottom line for me is that creating the energy system of the second half of the 21st century is going to require trillions of dollars of investment. It will require trillions of dollars of investment, whether it's fossil technology or renewables. And the choice about when we start transitioning to renewables is really what we're talking about. When will we make the transition? If we wait another 10 years or 20 years before we really get serious about accelerating the transition, we will have baked a whole range of new impacts into the global scene. Impacts in terms of droughts, wildfires, sea level rise, heavy flooding and precipitation. If we start to act now, basically unleashing the opportunity for market forces to capitalize on this need for new infrastructure, we have the potential to transition to a global regime where at the end of the 21st century we may be looking at something like 3 to 5 Fahrenheit, around 2 C of total global warming. Now that's a level of warming that's more or less from now until the end of the century, the amount we've seen from 1900 until now. We know that that's caused impacts, but we also know that with ambitious investments in preparedness, we can deal with that. If we look at unmitigated climate change, we really can't deal with it.
Now. We can't deal with it now if it's unmitigated climate change.
Well, through the century, we will see accumulating damages, accumulating risk, and accumulating interactions between sectors that are no longer able to perform at a level that provides the goods and services that we demand.
There's also, I mean, again, this is a global problem, so it's easy to get mired in the domestic politics of this. It is a global problem. It has to be solved at a global scale. But there's a moral issue about what Chris is talking about too, and we haven't talked about the natural world and how it's affected by the climate change that we're causing. Think about sea level, for example. We are probably very close to the point where both Greenland and West Antarctica, those large ice sheets, tiny compared to East Antarctica, but still quite large, together they're about, well, it's probably something on the order of 15 meters of sea level rise. We are probably almost already committed to having that happen. Now, we don't know whether it's going to happen over 200 years or over 500 years, and that's difficult to get your head around. but we're talking about imposing a rapidly changing environment for generations to come. We are giving our legacy to future generations is an ever-changing environment, essentially destroying a lot of the modern civilization that we've had for thousands of years. That's tragic. And I don't think people understand the momentum in this system. Now, at the global scale, the global discussions and global agreements are great because they can create the markets that Richard was talking about. But ultimately, it's the confluence of technology that becomes disruptive that ultimately displaces fossil fuel. But let's not fool ourselves. 80% of the carbon that's a resource, that's the fossil carbon that we need to keep in the ground, is in the form of coal. And there's so much of it, especially in Russia and the US, it's going to be very cheap. It's very cheap to pull coal out of the ground if we don't count the health effects and we don't count the climate effects. And it's fundamentally, this is about keeping that carbon in the ground. That's a really big challenge. And maybe disruptive technology will get us there, but there has to be broad political and social will as well.
Rebecca.
I'm so glad Dan raised this, because we're all sitting here and we're being economists and scientists and talking about cost benefit. And I remember explaining to my 16-year-old, climate change. And he said, so let me get this right. We're talking about putting at risk the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people for many hundreds of years. I mean, one of the nastiest pieces of cynical production is the fossil fuel companies saying they really care about the poor. I mean, if you really care about the poor, you care about climate change. He says, let me get this right, and we might lose half the bird species, and Boston might flood, and it would cost us 3% of GDP to fix. And I see it in my students. On the one hand, they're all like, I'm an MBA, and I'm going to do the numbers, and I'm going to write. And the other half, their heart is bleeding. And so how do we unite that?
Okay, but the biggest bully pulpit in this country is in the White House. Has the president done what he needs to do in terms of carrying that message?
I don't know whether you heard the speech he gave in late June 2013 when he launched the Climate Action Plan. Right. But he told that story. He told it very powerfully, and he told it in terms of future generations, our children and our grandchildren.
And was there a resonance to it?
The permanent damage. I think the resonance is seen in part in the degree of follow-up there's been on the 3 pillars of the Climate Action Plan he launched at that moment. He continues to talk about it. He talked about it in the State of the Union message. I mean, I don't think we've ever had a president talk as much about any environmental issue as this president.
And why would he say there has not been more done?
Well, I would say there has not been more done. First of all, if you look at what happened in the first term, there was a lot done in terms of the first ever combined fuel economy and CO2 emission standards, first for light-duty vehicles, then for heavy-duty vehicles. There were 17 new stringent appliance efficiency standards launched.
Our colleague Jody Freeman was very involved in that.
There were goals set and pursued. There were enormous investments made in clean energy. The Recovery Act had $80 billion for clean energy and energy efficiency in it. The budgets, Richard was mentioning how important energy R&D is. The budgets for early stage particularly and envelope-busting R&D, ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Project for Energy, the energy innovation hubs around the country. That was the first term when people were saying we weren't doing much. The one thing we failed to do, we could not get comprehensive climate legislation in the first term. Waxman-Markey passed in the House, languished in the Senate. Right. Then comes the 2012 election, and there's no longer a chance of getting the Congress to act. But the administration has been using every executive authority it has got in order to move the needle on climate change. And if we had the Congress with us, we could do more, sure enough. We'd love to have them with us.
Before I leave the national, I'm going to talk about the university and what Harvard's doing, what a university ought to do, and other sectors within our society. What ought to be, we're facing a presidential election, what would you like to see as the debate?
I'd like to see a debate.
You'd like to see a debate?
No, in 2012, we didn't even have a debate. It was the first time, I think, since either 88 or 84, climate change did not come up in any of the presidential debates between the two major party candidates. So I'd like us to have an honest conversation with the people who want to lead our country for the next 4 years.
Anyone else? Naomi?
Look, I think all of us know that Washington politics are pretty dire right now. And so I guess I'm thinking a lot more about what we can do here at Harvard as individuals in our own communities. And, you know, we all talk about how important and grave this issue is, but I don't think we're acting as if it's as urgent as we say we think it is.
You're now saying we, Harvard.
Yeah. I mean, yes. So we can talk, I mean, I was going to say some of the same things that Dan said. We can talk about disruptive technologies, but I think we're at a point where we need a disruptive politics. And we need a disruptive, thank you, but it's okay. We need a disruptive social conversation. We really need to change this conversation. And I'm going to throw in the issue of divestment here, because this is why I support divestment, because I don't see how we can have the conversation we're having here and still be continuing to invest in companies that are building more fossil fuel infrastructure, gas terminals that will be active for 50 years, oil and gas wells that will be active for 10, 20, 30 years. We are continuing to build infrastructure that is locking us into the very grave problem that we claim to be very, very worried about. And one of the things we know about the fossil fuel industry, and I agree coal is a gigantic problem, but how can we tell the rest of the world not to burn the coal they have when our own companies, multinational corporations that are identified as American by and large, are continuing to explore for still more oil and gas all around the globe? Reserves of fossil fuels that we know will drive us not just past the 2-degree limit, but past 4, 5, 6 degrees into truly catastrophic territory. So we're saying that we get that this is grave, we're saying that we really understand it's problematic, and yet we're still invested in and locked into and supporting a system that is driving us in the direction of a crisis.
Can I talk about a broader...
Yes?
Let me step back and say broadly what the university can think about, and at least from either 4 big components. The first is lifestyle. You know, how much energy does the university use? How aggressive is the university about its facilities and its policies and its future? The second is influencing the politics, and how does the university train future politicians? How does it encourage students to have the moral fiber and the integrity to be involved in politics? The third is the technologies, and we know that we're making tremendous progress with new technologies, but a core engine for the creation of the disruptive technologies and the integration of those technologies got to come from research that comes from great universities like Harvard. And so driving those technologies forward. And then the fourth thing is what the university does with its investments. And I think that Naomi makes a compelling point that you can't divorce the investments from everything else the university does. But those other things need to be there, the 4 components: the lifestyle, the invest style, the training style, and the vote style.
Rebecca?
Oh, I was afraid you'd do that. So my son, my partner, my best friend, they're like, Rebecca, you've got to divest. I mean, what's the issue? This is immoral. How can... And it makes me so uncomfortable. So I'll tell you why it makes me uncomfortable. I think we should divest from coal. I've said that publicly. I believe it. The reason I think that is that coal has hugely well-documented health effects. And so to me, it falls under the rubric of tobacco. It's just general social consensus. We should not be burning this fuel. The reason I'm so nervous about all fossil fuels is I don't think all fossil fuel companies are the same. And, you know, I think Shell is different from Exxon. And I think we're going to need oil and gas going forward. We keep using it. I fear that in saying we're going to divest oil and gas, we're trying to sort of cast the devil out from inside of us. When we all use oil and gas all the time, I'd like to be really targeted. I'd like to say, mucking up the political process is not okay. And we're going to call out people who do that. Funding denial, not okay. I want to call out the behaviors that I think are really inappropriate and bring those home to the company. But I'm very uncomfortable with a blanket policy. Many people not in this room think that this would be a political decision. And I fear that making a decision that would be seen as very political might hurt the long-term standing of the university. And I think we have a very important role to play in supporting the conversation. And I'm also, you have to help me with the theory of change.
Okay, I'm going
You have to help
Okay,
me.
thank you. That's what I want to do.
It's
So
like,
first of all,
yes,
I'd like
chain myself to the railings at Exxon, check.
it's not
But
about
like,
changing
I
yourself
don't
to
own
the
their
railings.
stock. I mean, help me.
Okay, so first of all, let's have dinner and I'm going to work with you because we're very, very close. There's all this small gap. So first of all, I want to say if the devil was inside me, I would want to get rid of him, okay? And we have to actually seriously think about that. We are in a system where we are engaged on a daily level through our personal activities, through our institutional investment policy. We are engaged with something that is deeply, deeply problematic. And we have to figure out a way to exorcise, remove ourselves, separate ourselves from that. And what the right metaphor is, we can talk about. Second of all, why not have a conditional divestment policy that begins with saying, first of all, we want every company that we're invested in to say loudly and clearly in public, climate change is real, it's driven by human activities, and we will not fund climate disinformation, nor will we support third-party allies like ALEC, which most of the fossil fuel companies still support, the Cato Institute. I can give you a long list of these groups that get money from the fossil fuel industries, and they're continuing to fund disinformation today as we speak. And I can tell you that. I can show you that documentation. And if they can show that they're not, with open accountability, open accounting, then we say, great, and now let's move forward on some of these other issues. We can talk about carbon sequestration. I mean, we could do that, and that could be a sensible, thoughtful, meaningful divestment policy.
Daniel.
So Naomi, the analogy with the apartheid movement, there was the Sullivan principles.
And they didn't work.
And they didn't work very well for apartheid. In some ways, they're better suited for climate because what Rebecca was saying is, putting all fossil fuel companies in the corner strategically is what I'm worried about.
But nobody's really saying that.
Now, at a basic moral level, the students are right. It's wrong to use fossil fuels. It's wrong to use natural gas. It's wrong to use oil. It's wrong to use coal. And yet, because alternatives are too expensive, we keep doing it. But the moral truth is still there. However, it's not, I actually care about solving this problem, not just taking a moral stand. There is a broad social movement, and remember that in any social movement, there's going to be different perspectives and different extremes, and people in the middle and people in the extreme, but we're all together moving forward towards the same goal, which is getting beyond fossil fuel. In my view, strategically, this is the way I think about it, that 99% of the money in the stock market in fossil fuels is in oil and gas, mostly oil. 1%, less even, is in coal. But coal is 70 or 80% of the problem and even bigger part of the public health problem. And so I'm not saying we give oil and gas a free pass. I'm just saying right now, at this point in the United States, in this part of our long battle to get rid of fossil fuels, I think, frankly, I fear we're not even winning the battle against coal. Look at Mitch McConnell right now. I want to win the battle against coal first, and then we can have a discussion about what to do next.
But this is strategies and tactics. I mean,
it is strategy and tactics.
We do all agree about what we're trying to achieve here. I think that's clear. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that Desmond Tutu has supported, he's come out in favor of fossil fuel divestment because one of the things he says is we need to apply to fossil fuels and to climate change the same strategies and tactics that worked in South Africa, including divestment. So I think that if we really look seriously at the history of social change and social movements, one of the things we see is that it's about social license, and it's about social acceptability, and about what signals we say, and particularly what signals leaders send. And this is where, again, I want to bring the conversation back to Harvard. And I agree, of course, it's a global problem, but I can't control the globe. I can't really control Harvard either, but I can at least try to influence Drew. So, we're here in a community that we have some influence over, and we're here on the stage because we're viewed as thought leaders. So what can we do as an institution? Harvard is a leader. We pride ourselves in our leadership. We pride ourselves in the fact that our students will become leaders. What levers do we have now? And it isn't just about coal. It's about the whole fossil fuel system.
So I think that our energy system is fundamentally different in character than the issue of apartheid. One did not need apartheid to live. We need energy to live. And to meet the desires of people around the world, some of whom don't have access to electricity, they need energy to develop economically and as humans. And so I think it is fundamentally different in character than apartheid. The challenge is that we have a current energy system that also has some very significant negative costs to it. I think that we need to bring this conversation back to the middle, because if we polarize this issue as so many other issues have been polarized, unless we bring it back to the middle, I think we will not progress. So I actually see this being an increasingly polarized conversation rather than something that brings us back to the middle.
So I'm trained as an economist, so I think about sort of the benefits and costs and try to weigh these. And when I think about the benefits of taking the sort of moral position, I'm convinced, in part by some of the arguments Rebecca made, that there's a lack of clarity. And I think the effectiveness of a moral position is a function in part of how clear it is. And I think that some of the ambiguities and the complexities here make it difficult for us as a university to take this moral stand and have a material impact on policies down the road. We've talked about transforming the energy foundation of our economies. We need policies, at the end of the day, to drive that transformation. And so when I look at the cost and I think about the opportunity cost, we have the passion and the energy of the students. I'd like them to direct that towards the politicians out there who say what I think is absolutely ridiculous things about climate change. That they actually can get away with calling it a hoax. And in fact, we've seen in recent elections where if they were to even discuss the issue, that would adversely impact their ability to raise money. So I'd like to see us direct our energy at imposing cost on people who are just ignoring or laughing at the problem.
That's supporting other candidates, I would assume.
Supporting other...
Yeah, in other words, you're saying, how do you direct it to the political arena? You do it by supporting candidates who express your own will, rather than those who are directly in opposition to what you believe in.
You look at the survey evidence.
Or otherwise.
The younger generations, the younger kids who aren't voting that much, though, disproportionately care about climate change. Let them go back, work in the political process. Think about going back to your homes and engaging in the state process. We're about to have, because of what President Obama is doing, we're going to rely on 50 governors to implement the Clean Power Plan. They will have a say in how this happens. Some of them have already said they're going to oppose it. Let's impose cost on them for trying to stop progress in tackling the problem.
All right, before I turn it over to an audience and take some questions from you, I want to give everybody here an opportunity to say, have we missed something that you think is substantial to this conversation that we ought to touch before we turn it over to the audience?
I just think the discussion of divestment obviously is important, but let's not miss the fact that the university and the role of this university in particular on this issue can't be measured by the discussion of divestment. Our educational role, first and foremost, but on top of that, the research, and there's so many examples. This panel here, we could replace it many times over, and no offense to anybody, but I don't think anybody would tell the difference. We are so fortunate to have so many wonderful people among our colleagues who could be up here in our places. That's a very special thing, and this is an amazing community, and the impact individuals have had. Roy Gordon, our colleague in chemistry, invented low-emission glass. Technology, policy, economics. This is an amazing community, and let's not forget the incredible role that we play in terms of educating our students and ultimately leading the world.
The climate challenge is a challenge we can solve, but every day we wait, it makes it more complicated and more expensive, and we build more impacts into the system. Absolutely. Yeah.
I just want to follow up on that. I absolutely agree, and of course I agree with what Chris said. No one is saying divestment is a panacea. It's a multi-pronged approach we need to take, and all the things that everyone has said are important and part of the story. But I just want to point out one additional thing that I think is unique and special about this. The fossil fuel industry has worked for 20 years to undermine the work that we at this university have done, including people sitting in this room. And that, to me, crosses a very profound line that we as an academic institution ought to be deeply, deeply troubled by. We spend our days and our nights and our weekends doing research, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and we have people in our own community, right? People we're invested with, people who we work with, people who sometimes fund our research, who are giving us support on the one hand, funding research, and then it's like the old pat you on the back with one hand, pick your pocket with the other, actively undermining what we do, with the other hand. And that, to me, is a profound, profound problem that I think needs to be on the table along with all these other issues.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm trying to figure out how I can do this, who has a microphone and who's standing up, but who has a question? Yes, right here, and then I'll go. There are two together there, but you have a mic?
The mics are back here.
The mics are where?
The mics are in the back.
Okay.
Let me just ask a question since I have a mic and other people are coming to the mic, if that's okay, Charlie. Right here in the middle?
All right, yes.
Yeah, okay. My name's Roger Shamel. I'm an alumnus of the business school, and I have a lot of classmates of the business school, which is a great school. I made my investments in my life out of capitalism, so I love capitalism. But my classmates still don't understand climate change. And getting back to Naomi's point, I don't understand why Harvard University, as a great educational institution, can't at least tell her alumni, all 250,000 of them, that climate change is real, urgent, and in need of our attention. My question is, I guess I didn't state it as a question, why doesn't Harvard do this? Can anybody answer that question?
So let me take a crack at that. I actually think it's really important. By the way, I've heard President Faust make speeches about how important climate change is, and I've heard a variety of other deans and various people talk about how pressing this issue is. But I actually think it's really important to remember that Harvard is a free and open place for exchange of ideas, and I actually think it's very important that Harvard doesn't have a stand. Individually, I advocate for it. I direct the Harvard University Center for the Environment, but the Center for the Environment actually needs to be open to lots of different ideas and different discussions. That's really important. That's what universities are about, and I believe that deeply.
All right. Anyone? All right, the question on the left. Yes, sir.
I'm a professor of regulation at the Solvay Brussels School of Economics and Management of the University of Brussels, and direct the Center on Regulation in Europe. I'm fascinated by this discussion, but I think a number of you said very rightly that we were talking about a global issue. And I was surprised that despite the pioneering role played by Europe, and the European Union in particular, in starting an international initiative on climate change, this doesn't seem to be present in US politics today. So I'd like to understand, and I think the word Europe has not even been pronounced except as an adjective by Rebecca when she was qualifying the heads of two energy executives. So I'd like to ask perhaps John Holdren, how does he see the role of Europe in the run-up to the Paris conference, COP21, next December? Thank you very much.
Good question.
Well, first of all, the conference is in Paris. Secondly, the European countries have been major partners with the United States in moving the whole climate agenda forward, doing it in the G8, doing it in the G8 plus 5, leading in the G20, doing it in the OECD. I mean, there's no question that we are closely aligned with our European partners in pursuing a truly global approach to addressing the climate change challenge. Most of us here on this panel have been talking about what we're talking about because we have more direct influence on what happens in the United States than we have on other countries. But there's no question that the European countries are valued partners. European countries have done some very interesting experiments with cap and trade. We've learned a lot from those. Again, I think what we're talking about here is largely what we can affect, but we are grateful indeed for the cooperation of the European countries, and we look forward to their continued cooperation through and at the Paris conference.
Do they see it differently in any way?
I don't think so. I think that if you look at the polling, a larger proportion of Europeans than Americans accept that climate change is real, that humans are responsible, and it's necessary to do something about it. However, it is also true that a higher proportion of Brazilians and Chinese agree that climate change is real, important, and we need to do something about it. I mean, the fact is the proportions in the United States are among the worst in the world, but they are still enough. That is, when you look at the proportion of people in the United States who do agree we should be doing something about climate change, it is a majority. It is a bigger majority than we've had on many other issues in which we managed to take political action. So I don't actually accept that our problem is that not enough Americans believe that we need to take action about climate change. I think our problem is in part that there are other things they rank more highly on their list of worries. Relatively few Americans vote for a candidate on the basis of that candidate's position on climate change. That's a weakness. But I think it's going to change as climate change becomes more salient to people, as more and more people see and feel and experience what's happening, again, as we said, where they live, where they work.
The risk to the planet.
And what they see on the television. Yeah.
All right, back to here. Yes, sir. And
I
then we'll go
wanted
back
to-
and forth.
Great. I wanted to ask a question that was more related to solutions. Several of you had mentioned that we need to not only do these more gradual solutions, lowering emissions and things like that, but we need to be more aggressive. And I know that there have been some scientific solutions that have been proposed, for example, the idea of the garden hose to the sky, where you can inject sulfur dioxide into the clouds that can actually dial down the temperature across the globe. And I was wondering, A, what you guys thought about the viability of these solutions, but also some of these more aggressive solutions, someone would have to implement them. And I think it also raises a question of who then has the power over the temperature of the planet, and what are kind of the political ramifications of that. So both what are some of these more aggressive solutions and how could they be implemented?
Yes.
So we've learned from past experience from major volcanic eruptions that they put these particles in the upper atmosphere and it does have a cooling effect for a short period of time. And some people think we should try to replicate that, whether it's using airplanes or just some kind of technology to shoot these particles in the upper atmosphere. They would have an impact in part on temperature. They would not affect all dimensions of climate change. They wouldn't do anything to the fact that the oceans are becoming more acidified. They would require, as you noted, a governance approach. And we're not very good. Right now in emissions mitigation, we're not very good on thinking about international governance. We're not very good thinking about it in the context of what people call geoengineering, this approach. And I think the concern that some have, though, is that one country, some people even say it could be a James Bond villain, could actually launch a so-called geoengineering solution. So this is something that I think is becoming part of the debate. There are certainly some scientists have actually embraced this as a short-term solution because we're not doing enough to mitigate our emissions and we may need to do this for a while as we continue to mitigate. It's certainly not a substitute for reducing our emissions. There are others who think that it should be a sort of insurance policy so that if we don't do enough to mitigate, if the science ends up being much worse than we think right now, we'll have this as an opportunity to tackle it. I think it is an opportunity that is appealing to some because it looks cheap and scares a lot of people because it looks cheap. And I think as a result, we need to start at some point having a conversation among countries, not just about how we mitigate emissions or how we adapt to climate change that is occurring and will continue to occur, but also what are going to be the norms both on the R&D side or potentially on the deployment side for these technologies.
That's exciting.
One more quick comment on that one.
Please.
There have been tens of thousands of papers on the causes of climate change and the impacts. There have been a few dozen papers on the solar radiation management. We know essentially nothing about it, and it's shocking to me that there is even advocacy for considering it as a possibility. We need to know a lot more about whether it's a viable option, and I think that the kinds of governance issues that you've raised and that Joe raised are likely to make it so complicated that even if technically it's feasible, it wouldn't be deployed. But we have no idea whether it's even technically realistic.
What's sort of interesting is that some of the people who have latched onto it as a perfect techno fix actually are the same people who denied the existence of the problem in the first place, which is kind of amusing. But at the same time, we need to take it very, very seriously. And the reason is we have to be a little humble about our knowledge of the climate system. There's a lot we don't understand. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And I would say, in my assessment, we tend to be conservative as scientists. We believe in 90 5% confidence intervals. And so there's a lot of things that we don't know that probably are going to be on the bad side of the equation. And there could be some nasty surprises. This may be a terrible idea, but it unfortunately might actually be an important idea. And we don't know yet, but we need to understand it much better.
All right, yes.
So I think this was a great conversation about the problem of climate change and potential solutions. And I kept getting excited that maybe someone would talk about the biggest contributor to climate change, and that's the animal agriculture industry. And so, especially when Mr. Rose asked if anyone felt like something was left out, and then no one said anything about that, I was just curious if someone could speak to maybe why they think that was left out of the conversation, and more importantly, whether someone thinks that's problematic in conversations like this about climate change.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think, as a historian, I really believe very, very strongly in the importance of historic legacies and the importance of origins. Climate change as a problem was really initially formulated by earth scientists. It was oceanographers and meteorologists who began to recognize the impact that carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases could have on the atmosphere. And, one of the things that's shocking to me about this history is how long it took for people to start talking about ocean acidification, which arguably is as serious, if not more so, than the warming of the atmosphere and the cryosphere. So because this came out of the physical science community, the discussion about impacts, both impacts on the biosphere and also impacts from the biosphere, land use changes, management, agriculture, has been slower, but it's definitely there. And certainly the IPCC, including under Chris's leadership, has been very, very assertive in helping us to think through some of these biological aspects as well. So I do think that's part of the conversation that we should be having. So thank you for bringing that up.
Anyone else on this? No.
Go ahead, Rebecca. Well, I was just going to say that it is an extremely important point that about a third of the total emissions come from greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide, and quite a lot of the carbon dioxide is associated with agriculture and especially with animal agriculture. And trying to figure out how in the long run we're going to deal with the emissions that come from agriculture, forestry, and other land use it's going to be a tremendously big problem. Honestly, I think it is a problem that needs to be solved more or less in the same time frame as solving the energy problem. The scale isn't as big yet, but as we get our hands around the energy issues, then we're increasingly going to have to deal with the ones that are associated with land use and agriculture.
And one of the reasons that's difficult to deal with is some of the biggest impacts are in poorer countries where it's marginal people leading the deforestation, and so it's socially and politically very tricky. And so it makes sense perhaps to focus on the developed world first, to the degree that we make a choice, although clearly we should not.
On the right.
Talofa, my name is Megan Mwana Palale Hoching. I hail from the village of Newell, American Samoa. And I was just wondering if you guys can speak about, on behalf of Pacific Island communities, which are positioned in between the two biggest contributors of climate change, and ironically will be the first ones to deal, or we're actually dealing with these issues. And I appreciate the contributions for solutions, but while these innovations are coming into effect, we actually have the sea levels lapping at our feet. So I was wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about what solutions are available for Pacific, or actually island communities worldwide, when we are the least amount of contributors, but still have the effects, or are dealing with this and potentially will not have our communities in the coming years. So should we as Pacific communities invest in becoming environmental refugees, or should we continue to find solutions that can help our specific islands?
So this is a tragic, and what you've pointed out is incredibly important and tragic because, quite honestly, there's very little that any of us can do about it. And we all know that. The water is literally lapping at people's homes, and very soon those islands will no longer exist. About 7 or 8 years ago, the president of Kiribati was here. And Kiribati is interesting among all the island nations because it's one of the largest in terms of how many people. It's about 100,000 people. And the reason that's important is it's too big for one country to take them in. Australia won't take 100,000. They might take 5,000 Nauruans. They're not going to take 100,000 Kiribati. And It was very interesting to hear the president of Kiribati talk about this. He said, at first we were very angry. We went around and wanted people to solve the problem for us. Then we realized that it wasn't going to happen. And we got over the anger and decided to actually take responsibility for it and begin to encourage people to create satellite settlements in other countries so that we wouldn't be environmental refugees, we would be environmental survivors. I found this incredibly moving. It's not an answer. It is a managing of a very difficult situation that ultimately is the destruction of people's homelands. But people in New Orleans in this country feel that way too, in certain areas that are now underwater. And we're going to see this more and more around the world. But this is, unfortunately, to use the pun, just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, just to add to that, I went to the UN conference on small island developing states that they have every 10 years and met with the president of Kiribati and a number of other heads of state from low-lying island countries. And there are no deniers in that group. Yeah. There is nobody from these island states who has any question about what's happening. And they are understandably incredibly frustrated about the degree of complacency and ignorance in most of the rest of the world about a threat for them that is absolutely an existential threat. But the challenge, as Dan Tragg has already pointed out, is that we have relatively little leverage on the problem of sea level rise over the long run. There is a difference in the rate of sea level rise that is projected if we do a lot of mitigation versus the rate that's projected if we do only a little. But it is quite likely that we are close to the point, if not already past it, where we're going to be committed over a period of some hundreds of years to multiple meters of sea level rise. And for countries that exist mostly within 1 or 2 meters of sea level, it's an unbelievable, not just challenge, but it's a fate.
It is a stark challenge, but it's also important to recognize that there are lots of things that can be done over the decades to centuries time frame, and that one of the really attractive features of building resilience, building the kind of preparedness that John has spoken of, is that in many cases the smartest steps for sustainable development align very nicely with the smartest steps for preparedness. A good example is just early warning systems for tropical cyclones, improving transportation, public health, communications networks. All those things can make societies more vibrant. They can encourage sustainable growth. At the same time, they enhance preparation for the kinds of risks that low-lying islands especially will increasingly face as the sea level continues to rise.
Thank you. Over here.
Jim Stock, Harvard Economics Department. As is pointed out, I'd like to return to coal. As has been pointed out in this panel, coal is one of the short-term opportunities for reducing CO2 emissions, and indeed has substantial health aspects associated with it. In the EPA's analysis of the Clean Power Plan, roughly half of the benefits, all of the benefits in CO2 emissions reductions come from reducing coal, and almost half of them come, almost half of the monetary benefits come from co-benefits associated with health. In that context, an interesting fact is that approximately 40% of the coal consumed in the United States is mined on federal lands. It's on lands that we own, that's mined through leases that last between this either 10 or 20-year leases to private coal companies. How do we think about that?
Well, I think that's a great point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think this is a really important point about what is our theory of social change, right? Because we do have control about that through the political system, but only if we can find a way to exercise that control. And right now, we don't have a political movement or even a political consensus, even a majority of Americans who are prepared to say, yeah, that doesn't make sense. So part of the challenge to us, I think, is to figure out how do we start that conversation that helps all of our fellow citizens across this country recognize there are things we can do, and the example you gave is a really great one. Many of my colleagues are advocates of a carbon tax. That's a really important, thanks, but it's really better if you don't clap so we have more time to talk. you know, a carbon tax is really, really important, but again, how do we get it? The idea of a carbon tax is not a new one. It's been on the table for a long time. Some of us will remember when then Senator Al Gore proposed the BTU tax. So the question is not, you know, the tax. The question is, what is the theory of social change or the theory of political change that gets it for us?
Can I make one comment? I want to expose the fact that Professor Stock was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors until he recently returned to Harvard, and he was a fantastic asset in the Obama administration, working on social cost of carbon, fabulous report that he led on the costs of inaction, the economic damage that we're facing. And all I can say, Jim, in answer to your question is, I wish you were back in the White House helping us think about this.
That's what we call a shout out. With this side.
Hi, thank you very much for your time. I'm very curious as to what are your thoughts on the new NASA publication about California, and how prepared is the United States to lose or to cut the water off on one of the largest economies in the world?
Well, as a Californian,
you should go first. But then.
Let me say, we have a clear understanding that California has struggled with constraints on water availability through the history of European settlement and presumably for thousands of years before that. But we also understand that drought amplifies or that climate change amplifies the risk of drought in two important ways in California. One is we know that these blocking highs that have directed the storms so that they missed us and hit you guys has been a feature that's amplified by climate change. And we also know that the big thing that's hurting California now isn't so much lack of precipitation. We didn't have that low a year in precipitation. It's that the precipitation that fell came as rain rather than snow, and now we don't have any snowpack to carry us through the summer. So it's clear that this is a climate change related phenomenon, and the opportunities we have for dealing with it are really very constrained by the fact that there's just less water available. There are lots of things that can be done to enhance efficiency, particularly in the agricultural sector, which uses about 80% of California's water. But we need to aggressively implement a wide range of policies that not only encourage efficiency, but also put tighter management over all the water resources, including the groundwater resources, and markets can be very powerful in doing that. California is just beginning to move into the area of systematic water markets, so we can let market forces help us drive the efficiency we're going to need in the long run.
The chair has a problem. Here's my problem.
A lot of people
I have about 5 minutes more, and people have been standing up there. So my effort to solve it is that we can have a Q&A here, but I'll give you each a chance just to say something precisely and quickly if you want to leave a question that's here. And believe me, questions have power. So with that point, I have to say, I don't want to be rude, but you've been standing, but the clock has been running. Go ahead.
Okay. So Ben Fron, I'm a PhD candidate in applied physics and a research fellow at the Kennedy School. So we heard a lot of preferred solutions today, but I think we need to keep in mind that this isn't a problem to solve with our preferred solutions, it's a problem to solve, period. Okay? Now, most of these aren't new. A race for technological breakthrough, Pigovian taxes, lifestyle changes. The clear historical fact is that none of these have been sufficient. So my very specific question is, you know, the university wants to continue putting forth these preferred solutions, none of which have been sufficient. I want to know, do you think the university should do something additional to that, something it has not done yet, and what should it be?
Thank you. The next question.
I think I was next over here.
Yeah.
You're right.
Tim DeChristopher from the Harvard Divinity School. Charlie asked you all what you think will precipitate the political will necessary for Congress to act, and none of you mentioned social movements. And so I'm wondering whether you all actually think that major change happens because experts figure things out, or whether there is a real role for social movements in this, and if so, why do you think that no one with a social movement perspective was invited to be a part of this panel?
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I'm Jane Mansbridge, and I teach at the Kennedy School. One of the panelists suggested that if Harvard divested from fossil fuels, then we must stop using fossil fuels immediately. And I wonder if one of the panelists could explain whether there is a necessary connection between divesting and stopping immediately. I think we could do divest and stop slowly. One big reason for divesting is that the business plans and the profits of the big companies depend on their being able to take out of the ground the reserves that they own. And if we had legislation saying they couldn't do that, the price of the companies would fall. So in a sense, we're betting that there won't be that legislation, that they'll be able to take the fossil fuels out of the ground, they'll extract them and burn them, and that would, many scientists agree, set our climate on an irreversible path. So it seems to me that's an immoral bet, and I wonder why we can't withdraw from that immoral bet and then in an individual way, as best we can, stop using fossil fuels over time. What's the connection?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir?
I think I'm next.
Yes, ma'am.
Helen Snow, a graduate of college and at school. This is another question like the guy talking about CAFOs and meat raising. Another question that I didn't hear addressed is there's an approach that is hopeful, essentially free, risk-free, non-polarizing, non-aggressive, and we can all do it. And that is sequestering carbon back in the ground. Some people call it carbon farming. I just didn't hear anybody mentioning this, but it actually has the potential to take a lot of that excess carbon and put it right back if we only had the political will.
Thank you.
There's a conference on it in 3 weeks.
Yes?
Hi, Koen Hofkens, climate scientist here at Harvard. I want to ask a quick question, social one actually. Should the Western world repay its historical carbon debt in addition to compensating or addressing the future, actually? So, short one.
Okay. Thank you. Yes?
Chris Young, a friend of Divest Harvard. I'm just shocked once again to hear the statistic about sea level rise and the words. I'd like somebody to explain how much they think of risk when all the leading glaciologists are suddenly saying, using the words irreversible and unstoppable in terms of West Antarctica and Greenland. To me, that's, as they say, a aha moment or shit hits the fan moment. For this is what the glaciologists are all saying. And I'd like them, I think this changes everything. And I'd like to know how we get this out there and how this is a steamroller to force public accountability. For example, indictments for fossil fuel executives. We did this with Rebecca executives. We can do it on so many levels. They have reckless endangerment, bribery, RICO Act. We have Harvard Law School. Here's something they can do. Get these people in jail right away.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Okay, we got a couple more here, don't we?
Yes. Okay. I'm Jeff Huggins, and I'm an alumnus of the business school, and I'm very fond of the business school. And first I want to say, thank you to everybody on the panel. But I think my point is that if if there was an alien intelligence from outer space looking down at Earth, they'd probably think that we were nuts, okay? And not only would they think that we're a little bit nuts because we've got this problem that we can't even grapple with after 30 years, but they'd also say, these humans have these great universities, Harvard, Stanford, Chicago, Oxford, Cambridge, Berkeley. So I've been to Berkeley and to Harvard. So how is it that they have these great universities, and they're very lacking in wisdom? And so it seems to me that that suggests a problem. And I want to end with throwing a question. I kind of want to cast doubt on, I think, what Dan was saying, and I've heard it very often, that universities don't take stands on things, no matter how important they are. And universities just can't use their institutional voices even when we're going to hell in a handbasket. So I think my question is, I'd like to challenge that philosophy.
Thank you. Couple more, and then we have to go.
Hi, my name's John Shapiro, and I'm coming from the medical school.
And my question is, what roles do you see healthcare providers have in terms of, I guess, combating global climate change within the context of the clinical setting, as well as, maybe increasing discussions about the connection between climate change and disease?
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Barney Brower. I'm an alumnus of the Graduate School of Education. Rebecca Henderson asked, what is the theory of change around divestment? And I would ask her to consider the gay marriage decision of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, in which a major institution, an established institution, stepped out ahead of the national consensus and accelerated a social change at a rate that most of us have never seen any social change in this nation before. And that what is being asked, and this is the theory of change, is whether Harvard, as a major institution of our nation, could step out, based on the importance of all that you have said today, ahead of the national consensus and lead the acceleration of the transition.
Thank you. Okay.
My name is Monica Frassone. I'm the co-chair of the European Greens, and I am very interested in understanding if you consider that an international agreement in Paris is a solution or not, since nobody really mentioned it, and this is very worrying for me. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Let me, as I said, I'm trying to end this on time, and say, in the best tradition of this great university, we've had an interesting dialogue. We've heard lots of opinions. We've brought together people who know what they're talking about and have contributed. It is just the beginning of a conversation. I know there are conversations on this campus all week and will extend because so much takes place here. Especially my thanks to the panel who've come here and had this conversation. It's been an honor to be with you, and I thank all of the panelists and have a lovely evening. Thank you.